Hey, welcome to Bible and Archaeology Live at a new time on Friday. We're so happy to have you with us here this evening for Bible and Archaeology, all about Judas, some of the life of Judas, some of the death of Judas. And so we want to give a little bit of a statement up front that we are talking about the life and death of Judas today, which does deal with self-harm. So just that's not all we're focusing on, but we do want to make sure that we're addressing that up front, that's what we're going to be talking about, focusing on today as we're coming to the end of our Easter season. Here, an important individual in the story of the crucifixion, Judas. And so we're going to be getting into some of the corners of that story today. But Bob, happy Friday. Happy end of the day on Friday. Glad to have you here.
End of the week. Thank you. Happy end of the week. And hey, tomorrow's game day.
Tomorrow is game day. Yes, as always. Iowa City is a busy place this weekend with March Madness. It's the place to be. Everybody knows it. ESPN knows it. Pat McAfee knows it. Happy to have you in Iowa City this weekend and hoping for a good game this weekend. Get things started off at Carver on a roll.
Yeah. And thank you, Pat McAfee, for coming to town. And thank you, world, for giving us snow after this nice, beautiful early spring for the last 6 weeks. Snow. So all these people are coming into town to watch the March Madness, and now they got snowed on. So, anyways,
Well,
yeah,
you got
we're
to let
very
people,
excited.
you got to give people the full mix of Iowa. If they got in a little
Yeah.
bit early, yeah, last week we had some wonderful, like 65-degree days already. And
Yep.
then, yeah, some snow today. Welcome to Iowa. We're happy to have you. Going to see some good basketball. And thank you for joining us today. Also want to make a note up front that if you're a regular with Bible and Archaeology Live, over the next couple of weeks, the time might be bouncing around a little bit. So keep an eye out because we're moving things around a little bit because some other projects that we're working on. Bob is doing some talks for the senior college here in Iowa on cities of the Bible material that may be something available for viewers in the future in some way, shape, or form. So there's a little bit of scheduling that's happening right now. So keep an eye for times with Bible and Archaeology. We'll still be here. We'll still be doing these live, but the time or the day might be moving around over the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye on the times and those
Let's
announcements.
just say it. It will be available in the future to all of you. I'm doing a talk for the senior college here at the University of Iowa, which is already sold out.
Yes.
But
Yes.
we're going to film it and turn it into a what do you call it? A master class. Turn it into an online class that will be available for people to acquire. So very excited about doing this we're going to film it over the next 4 weeks. The class will be available live over the next 4 weeks, and happy to be working with the senior college. What a great organization. And of course, all of the seniors here in Iowa City. I'm very excited to be working with them. But yeah, we're going to be doing this at 5 o'clock for the next month or so.
Yeah.
And I know we've gotten some feedback from some of our viewers and via Patreon that they like this moving from 11 to 5 because now they can catch it after work. I already see a comment there. Hey, I can make it on my drive home. So this is great. We're
Yeah.
very
So
excited to be doing this.
if this time is good for you, let us know. There's lots of ways to be in touch with us. In the description down below is our email, Bible-archaeology@UIowa. As Bob mentioned, you can join us on Patreon. Patreon, it's Excavator if you want to be able to support us, but also you can submit questions that you have or episode recommendations. You can do that there. You can also keep track of us on social media or through our website, Bible and Archaeology. And there you can also sign up for our newsletter. So if you're wanting to be notified when any future projects may be available to you, there's lots of ways to be notified of that. And you can always come back here for Bible and Archaeology and you'll hear the updates here. But there's lots of ways to be in touch with us. And if you're here watching live, please feel free to leave a question or a comment in the chat. We'll get to some of those if we can. If you leave a super chat or a super sticker on your question, we'll make sure that we come to that. But we've got a full slate of things. So if you're leaving questions or comments in there, please feel free. But super chat and super comments will be answered. And another thing I want to make sure to point out too is that we are coming up towards a Bible and Archaeology Live. The first Friday of every month is a questions free for all Bible and Archaeology Live. So it's questions only. So that's the top of the month. If you have a question you know you want to be answered, Patreon is a way to make sure you can submit that for that episode, or join us on that day. You can throw a question in for drop-in hours essentially with Bob and see what gets covered. It's a little bit of it's no holds bar. It's free for all. Everything is fair game. So
Yeah,
that's the first Fridays.
It gets pretty wild, and any question that comes in, we answer, especially if they're putting it on a sticker. And I think last time we did that, we had a bunch of people just firing away.
It's a good time. So keep an eye out for the first Fridays of the month. It's Bible and Archaeology live, questions only. It's a free for all. So that's coming your way in not too long. But let's start off with a little bit of the news recap. You can stay up to date on the news at Bible and Archaeology, but 2 news stories for us this week. The first news story is a little bit of like a commentary follow-up on a news story that we had done. Let's keep that one for a second. The first one, let's go back underwater. We'll start with a little bit of fun. Another underwater archaeology story like last week. But this week, it's the discovery of 5 canoes that were found at the bottom of an Italian lake that date somewhere between 5700 and 5100 BCE. The boats are dug out canoes, as you can see here. They're found at what used to be a settlement on dry land that's now underwater because of shifts here. And there's a claim being made that they're the oldest boats in the Mediterranean, is currently what's being proposed here. The boats range in size, with the smallest ones appearing to be small fishing vessels. But what's really interested archaeologists about these is the 2 largest canoes are over 36 feet long and appear to have the infrastructure in them to have supported longer distance travel. There's some T-shaped wooden implements that look like tie-off points, either for sails or for outrigging or other implements. And because of the size, they think that this might have facilitated long distance travel or long distance trade here in the region at a very early point. So they're interested to see if they can find other implements here from this site. Again, it's all underwater, so it's a slow process as they're going through. But they did also find some farming implements at this site last year. So getting a fuller understanding of this place as we go slowly but surely with another underwater excavation.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see if they can find other evidence that would indicate that this was a long distance travel, that it wasn't just, bumping along the coast and trying to move some raw elements, some ingots or, whatever, but that actually they were migrating, that they were actually trying to move a distance. That would be an interesting, especially given the time period. This is actually a movement of some people.
Yeah, so they're going to continue to explore here. They're excited by the discovery of 5. It's not just one, which really has their interest, that you've got a small collection here. So they're interested to see what else they can find that speaks to the broader nature of this. And our second,
it's an early flotilla.
A small armada of canoes out on the lake here. Our second story, this is the little bit of a follow-up story. So 2 weeks ago, we discussed what is being called the oldest discovery of bread, and that comes from Catalhoyuk. So this site of Catalhoyuk, an old site here, it's a well-known site. The bread that they found is a leavened bread that dates to around 6600 BCE. And in an article this week, Sarah Bond, a professor here at the University of Iowa, along with another writer, they addressed some questions or concerns that we want to talk about here, because this does follow up somewhat with a story that we talked about even a couple of weeks back about a pendant that's now on tour, and just how some of these archaeological claims get used in questions that maybe sometimes we should be asked. And in a story, you may be thinking, we're just talking about bread. What exactly do we need to be thinking about or asking questions about? One of the main points that they raised is the connection that can be made in some arguments between the emergence of bread and agriculture, and then arguments of first civilization. And so when we're defining something as bread or calling something the first bread, it may be an argument that's just made about this individual object, or people may try to use this for larger claims, larger arguments about the emergence of civilization tied to a particular region. And so they wanted to highlight that there have been unleavened breads found in other places. There's questions about ancient Mesopotamian beers, which is a fermented process of should that be considered within the bread production. Some people consider that a part of it. An early cake-like substance would be used within those. There's also an unleavened bread find that comes from a nearby region with a Naftalian settlement that dates back even further to 12,400 BCE, but that's an unleavened wild grain flatbread. So some people say, oh, that's not so much of a bread, that's more of a something in between. But just one of these, as we're reading these stories, what kind of questions should we be thinking about? How can these things be used? None of what they said is to say that they're not, that this isn't bread or that this isn't an old find. They're very clear about that. But just one of those, keep an eye for how people may use a find like this to support other arguments, similar to our commentary on that pendant find.
A lot of this is just, and it's not just scholars, it's everyone, but it's this desire to be first. We want to have the first or the earliest bread, but anybody who likes to eat as much as I do knows that there are so many different kinds of breads and so many different kind of cuisines that, it's, is it naan, is it injera, is it, these Italian, is it sourdough, is it pita bread? These are all, leavened versus unleavened. The whole argument over whether the early Egyptian beer should be considered as liquid bread, did it rise and how much did it cook? And let's concede that these are all different things, and that I think about this this book that we read to my kids. I have 11 children, right? This book that it was, which is your favorite kid? And well, you're my favorite first baby, and you're my favorite second baby. And maybe some listeners will get this book, but if people could learn to just say, hey, we made this amazing discovery and it's significant, and here's why it's significant, instead of trying to sensationalize it to be the first of everything, to be the earliest of everything, and just acknowledge it for what it is instead of going for the biggest, baddest headline, that would usually solve a lot of these problems. But, because if it's bread, I'm going to want to eat it anyway.
Yeah. And there's some of the back end of how archaeology happens too that can lead to some of these first or oldest claims, because you need money to dig. You need money for excavations. And so the claims of first or oldest sometimes can be made because if you can get good eyes on your site or on your story, that can help lead to donations or to future support for excavations. And sometimes it's made absolutely in an attempt at fairness, and sometimes it gets exploited past what they are saying by other persons. So it's just one of those, as you're reading things, some of the questions to be asking yourself of how does this get used? How secure was this found? Or what other questions might they be wanting to address with this find?
And it's not always the archaeologist's fault. Sometimes the archaeologists are incredibly responsible and give a responsible interview and are very, very nuanced. But the journalist or the publication knows that is not going to pop as much, is not going to grab. So they'll sensationalize it, and it has nothing to do with the archaeologist. So just again, we live in an age where you have to read through it and learn to discern. But you got me hungry now. We're talking about bread. So let's get on to Judas.
Yes, let's leave our well, we're not going to quite leave the complications behind, because we're jumping from some of the news story complications into some of the Judas complications and the things that we know about Judas, right? If we're starting off, just identify one of the 12 disciples, the one who betrays Jesus. Maybe, he's known as looking suspicious in the painting of the Last Supper, but Judas is one of these figures that has a very important role in the story of the crucifixion, but also, maybe understandably, doesn't get that much coverage in the Gospels. And there's some competing traditions within the Gospels of exactly what he does, why he does it, when he does it. And so before we get to the death of Judas, I think we do need to step back and make sure we're really framing who Judas is, because he's more than just the betrayer. There's more in the Gospels than this. And this connects with one of the questions in the chat here of whether Judas is a real figure, or is Judas one of these created fall men that gets brought into the gospel traditions? And so we need to start here with some of the basics. Judas Iscariot, for some, they see that last name as a reference to the Sicarii and this zealot group. And so is this his real surname, or is this a surname that gets created because of other associations? An interesting fun fact with Judas is, maybe unsurprisingly, he's usually listed last in the
Hmm.
lists of the apostles. He comes at the end, and he is also identified as the treasurer of the disciples in the Gospel of John. And John is one of these, I don't know, he's not too kind to Judas in most of his descriptions. And so when we have this story in John 12 with the washing of Jesus's feet, Judas raises this question of how much this perfume costs.
Right.
And John's response is that he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the
Right.
common purse and used to steal what was put in it. So this is where we get
Right.
that description of Judas as treasurer for the group, but also
Right.
thief, with a real eye towards maybe the end of Judas's life here.
Yeah, this is something that takes place after the fact, right? Remember, this stuff happened early in the second, third decade, and is written down at a later time. But it's a phenomenon that we see, for instance, and that I talk about in the Melchizedek book, that happens to Sodom.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at all of the references to Sodom in the Hebrew Bible, they're always going to make some kind of parenthetic remark about Sodom with regard to its sinfulness or the fact that God destroyed it, with the exception of in Genesis 14 and one other area where God is actually trying to do something positive. That is, prior to the destruction of Sodom, you have a couple of references that may be glosses, but it's there almost every, with very few exceptions, almost every reference to Sodom includes this parenthetic because it was written after the fact, and they always want to be sure to say Sodom, that really evil city, or that city that God destroyed. It just becomes part of the identity of Sodom. And that's what happened to Judas. The truth is, Judas was probably an incredibly important figure, if not the administrator for the 12. He was put in charge of the money. He was
Yeah.
a trusted person. And so, and if he's not an outspoken person, he's working in the, I want to say in the shadows, but he's probably a quiet, trusted person, the last person that you would expect to do this. And that's how he was able to do it. And so the one who betrayed Jesus, that all comes after the fact. That probably wasn't how he was perceived at the time of Jesus's ministry.
Well, in this, I think we should touch here too with an earlier reference to Judas in John as well that goes even one step further, which this is when Jesus is talking to his disciples and he's speaking and he says, "Who have you come to believe that I am? We know you're the Holy One of God." Jesus answered them, "Did I not choose you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." And verse 71 clarifies
Right.
for us, don't be concerned here. Who was he talking about? He was
Right.
speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he, the one of the 12, was going to betray him. So early on in John here, hey,
Right.
we all know how this story ends, but we
Right.
also know that one of us is a devil. Who's the devil? Judas. So we get these little insertions within our Judas story early on to make sure that the audience doesn't forget that he's the traitor, doesn't forget what he's going to do before we even get to that part of the story.
Right. This isn't a mystery, right? The Gospels aren't, some of them start with, hey, by the way, this is the story of the good news of Jesus, the Son of God, right? They're telling you who he is, and they're revealing who he is up front. Now, whether or not those were later insertions, but they're putting it up front at the beginning of the Gospels. And then it's not like we're trying to like good stories are today. You're trying to piece it together as you watch it and you're working through it. The Bible in certain key places just say, by the way, here's what this guy's going to do. We
Yes.
hate this guy. He's a bad guy. He's going to betray Jesus. And this, like I said, this is what they do with Sodom, and this is what they do with Judas. So you have certain figures, usually ones that are so bad that this becomes part of their identity. And we find out about Judas well before the events take place.
Let's get to some of the events that take place. And I think we have
Mhm.
to start with the question of who approaches who. We're going to get to betrayal, but before we get to betrayal, there has to be some sort of agreement regarding betrayal. And It's something that I think we don't always think about. We harmonize traditions. Naturally, we harmonize. We want to remember one version of the story, but the Gospels aren't all in agreement on exactly how the deal gets worked out or what the deal even is regarding the betrayal. Matthew and Mark have a version of accounts where Judas approaches the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I betray him?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. This is in Matthew 26. And from that moment on, he began to look for a moment, an opportunity to betray him. So in Matthew and Mark, we get presented with this story where Judas, before being approached, out of the blue seemingly, goes to them to say, "Hey, how much are you going to pay me in order to betray him?" And Matthew gives us that 30 pieces of silver. This is what we're going to give you. Mark continues that Judas approached first, but it's just, "We'll agree to pay you." The number, and not the biggest deal in the world, but the number gets left out. However, this is significantly different in feeling to me from the way we get it presented in Luke, where Luke 22 tells us, "Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot. He went and conferred with the chief priests and officers of how he might betray him to them. They agreed." So we go from Judas seemingly just goes up to approach them. Luke presents us as Satan entered into him. And in John, we have a similar follow-up here in John 13, but it's that the devil is involved. The devil put it into the heart of Judas to betray him. So, Bob, why do we have this split where some of these traditions are having it fall on Judas is the one coming in, but then half and half?
Right.
Luke and John say the devil, even though John further earlier identified Judas as a devil. Now the devil made me do it.
Right. No, John is clearly being consistent right here. You're a devil and the devil's responsible for this. And so that's John's in the clear. But among the synoptics, you probably have Mark first saying that Judas was looking for an opportunity. And then the question we get is, why did he do this? What changed his heart, right? These guys are devoted to Jesus. And maybe it could be that Judas, the Messiah that Jesus was talking about becoming, wasn't necessarily what Judas signed up for, right? Especially if he was a Sicarii,
If he's a
right?
Sicarii.
Especially if he was, "We're going to overthrow Rome and we're going to do that. I'm with you." And then Jesus is talking about, loving your enemy and paying taxes to Rome, and it's our kingdom's not of this world.
Yes.
And Judas, maybe he just became disillusioned and said, "Yeah, this isn't what I want to." And so he's going to hand him over, make some money, and start over.
He feels like he joined the wrong gang, maybe. And if you're looking for a conversation on messianic expectations, conveniently, you can look to last week's live for a discussion of this. But Mark, maybe Mark is presenting him as this disillusioned disciple looking for a little NIL money. Maybe he's been doing the work for a couple of years and he's looking for a payout.
He's going to enter the portal and he's going to get out of this following Jesus, and he's going to go, play for LSU. Yes, that's a dig. Then Matthew, of course, follows Mark and repeats this same thing. And so what's interesting is Luke, and I think we can explain it here. Luke is also the same gospel that when anything happens, or often when things happen, Luke will say, "And the Holy Spirit caused him," or "the Spirit came upon him." So Luke is the same gospel that's always got things happening by the power of the Spirit, and the Spirit, came upon him, and so in the same way that the Holy Spirit is responsible for many of the actions that take place, that when the Holy Spirit isn't mentioned necessarily in Mark and Matthew, you've now got, and Satan is entering in. It's more of I don't want to say a spiritual warfare, but you've got Luke describing it as the Holy Spirit and Satan are causing this to take place in people, whereas Mark, it's like, this is what he did. Again, Mark's a very matter-of-fact gospel, and Matthew is following Mark. Luke is kind of looking into a little more to the spiritual realm, I would argue. And then John is doing his own thing.
And this presents one of the questions regarding Judas. And we're not going to go fully down the path of the Gospel of Judas today. That's a topic all in its own, but Luke seems to be addressing this question of, is this decision really up to Judas? Or is this the role that Judas was cast and Satan enters into him and he does this? Does Judas, Bob, do you think Judas has a choice? Can he choose not to go through this if we're going with Matthew and Mark and he's just looking for the opportunity? And are John and Luke fixing that of, no, it's not up to him, and in that, not my will, but yours, but pushing it the opposite direction of somebody's got to be the betrayer here. The lot's been cast. The disciples draw lots to get a replacement. So
Yeah.
the question of free will.
Well, I mean, you could do this free will versus, determinism, which was Josephus talks about it. You have this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These guys were very determinist. This was a debate that was going on just like we have it today. But you've also got, the Gospel of Judas actually makes the case, which would come along later, actually takes the case that he had to betray him. Judas had to betray Jesus, because if Judas doesn't betray Jesus, we don't have the plan of salvation. We don't have, if Jesus doesn't die, if he's not betrayed and he doesn't die, then sins aren't forgiven, right?
Yeah.
So you could argue Jesus went to Judas, according to the gospel, that he went to him and said, "Hey, I need you to do something for me." Right. And so, that's an apocryphal gospel.
Yes. Yeah.
But then we can get back to this, your original question. Was this a predetermined thing so that the overall plan? I tend not to think that way, because I tend not to think in a predeterminist even though I will acknowledge that a lot of things are not necessarily our choice. But I give them to biology, not divine predeterminism, right? That said, I would like to think that this is what Judas did, and then we're always trying to find reasons to explain why people did what they did. And I am sympathetic to the view that Judas just wasn't satisfied with what was going on, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm going to get out of this, and I might as well make some money doing it." And then, of course, immediately regrets it. We'll talk about this in a second, but he is going to do that. He's going to experience those same feelings that one experiences when you betray someone. And interestingly, I like to, and we'll do this on another episode, I like to compare Judas's response to being betrayed to Peter's, or Judas's response to betraying Jesus to Peter's response to betraying Jesus. And Judas, didn't stick around for us to hear more about it, but Judas is a much more heartfelt than Peter. Just listens to this bird crow and is like, "Yeah, okay,
it happened."
Yeah, that happened, and it happened 3 times, and okay, I guess I'll become a leader now. It's so we can look at this from many angles, but Judas is conveying a very human emotion, that he's dissatisfied with the person that he's agreed to follow, to serve, and so he sells him out, and now he's feeling this betrayal, and he's dissatisfied with his life. And it's a commentary on loyalty and following through. And there are other ways to get out of a situation other than selling someone out, right? We can learn a lot from what Judas does here on how to leave an organization, on how not to leave an organization, things like that. And I think that's what's commenting. I think you're saying it that it's, the devil made me do it is an easy way to abdicate some of this responsibility.
Let's move ahead a little bit in our timeline. Once he started to look for this opportunity, we get to this moment that we're familiar with in paintings, the moment of the Last Supper, which is also this, it kind of feels like a parlor game moment, this identification, because Jesus gives the hints to the disciples of someone is going to betray me, and also a hint as to who the one is of who was doing this. And so in Matthew, we get that the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me. will betray me, which has to be a moment of somewhat a panic of everyone looking around and thinking, when did I dip? And did I? That wasn't me. Which bowl did I use? I'm glad I'm on this end of the table. Maybe I was
Right,
worried I wasn't
right.
sitting by Jesus, but now I'm very happy I'm not sitting by Jesus. Mark follows up on that same thing. One who is dipping bread into the bowl with me, which almost makes it feel more like, is Judas doing this at the same moment? And Jesus is looking around like, hey guys, whoever is doing this. Luke makes it almost more parlor game like, which was
Hmm.
the one who betrays me is the one with his hands on the table. Or so maybe Jesus is just mad about the manners here of elbows on the table, hands on the table. But Luke says it's the one who has the hands. And again, John is different, as one might expect. It's the one whom I give this piece of bread
Yeah.
when I've dipped it in the dish, which feels like the other ones, there could be some confusion of who did it and who did when. And Jesus, seemingly here in John, it feels like, I don't know, in my mental image of this, Jesus holds up the piece of bread and he says, hey, everybody, whoever I give this to. And then, so when he dipped the piece, he gave it to Judas. But yet, seemingly, they get confused. And then John says, Satan entered into him. Jesus said, do quickly what you are going to do. And no one knew at the table why he said this to him, even though he just said, hey, whoever I give this to. So we get more confusion, and some of them, maybe is this the dumb disciples tropes that we get throughout some of the gospels where they're just missing the point? Or is this something else?
No, I think first of all, clearly, I think in John they are setting this absolutely up as like that final scene of name your show, but in Survivor where they come out and he goes, and the winner is, you got to give the rose to somebody. That's another show, I think, but they give the whomever I give this morsel to, and he's walking around and they're playing the stringers, the dramatic music, and I mean they're focusing in on, and it's like, who's it going to be? And they show the one still shot of I watch a lot of Great British Bake Off, right?
Yes.
And so, who's it going to be? And then they announce it, right? And so you've got a lot of that going on in John right here. But this other one is like, you know, the ones the hands on the table or the party dip. And so he's trying to hint at it without explicitly saying it. Whereas in John, it's just, yeah, here it is. And then he says a line that I use a lot. I love this line. And I don't just use it when people are going to betray me, right? I love it. Whatever you're going to do it quickly,
Yeah.
right?
Get it over with.
Rip the Band-Aid off. Just get this over with. Don't, if it's something that's bad that's got to happen, do it and let's move on. And it's good advice. But it's something that Jesus says, knowing that it's going to hurt him. But he's like, dude, don't drag this out. Whatever you're going to do, get it done. Go do it quickly.
And Judas is good. He gets up and he immediately went out. And everybody, right, John tells us they're all thinking, oh, maybe he's going to go pay for something, again, because he's in charge of the common purse. And so this little detail that we introduced earlier of he's the treasurer now gets used as an explanation for why we don't assume suspicious motives here. With Judas, after this moment of someone's going to betray me, handoff, Judas runs away. They go, oh, no, he's just going to go pay the tab. He's going to take care of us. We're okay.
It's not an odd thought, because earlier, prior to the dinner, he said, hey, you two go up there and get this colt.
Yeah.
And if anybody asks you, tell them the Lord needs it and they'll let you have it. So Jesus, we have right before the Last Supper, we have this story of Jesus dispatching some people to go bring them things, right? So this is just another one of those where he leans over, hey, I need you to go do something. And Judas goes running out. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't. We don't know, but it's part of the story, and the way that it's written, it's compelling us to the next scene in the story.
Our next scene in the story is that moment in the garden, which is, we all have this idea. I think we're familiar with the main version of this, which is with the kiss, that Judas betrays Jesus with the kiss. But maybe not surprisingly at this point, you can probably guess who goes a different path when we come to the moment of betrayal, which is John. And here we have no kiss, but it's this self-identification game. And it's, who are you coming for? This is who I am. Who are you coming for? This is who I am. And so Judas is there. The priests are there, and in some versions there's the temple guard there, some versions not. But this moment of the kiss changes with John, and so it's this question and answer, this moment of self-identification, which is another attestation to who do you say I am? Here I am. And we have the kiss. We've had the exchange. We've had the agreement. We move through. And I think let's get here to the moment of Judas's death. And we're going to move past the moment of crucifixion. These things have taken place. And we get to that moment of regret that you were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. In one account and not in the other. And again, Judas's death, maybe to make sure that we have this clear, isn't accounted in all of the Gospels.
Right.
Judas's account is described in Matthew, and then a different version is described in Acts. But otherwise, in the other Gospels, Judas betrays and then just kind of vanishes.
Disappears, yeah. And we get this betrayal in Matthew 27, if you've got that.
Yeah, I'll pull that up right here.
Where Jesus where Judas goes out and he just he hangs himself, and because of this, you see the regret. Again, remember, Peter betrayed Jesus 3 times and just goes on with his life, and then the cock crows and he realizes, oh my gosh, I've betrayed him. But he doesn't, I mean, he probably regrets it. I've always drawn a parallel, by the way, and I'm sure others have as well, but I've always drawn a parallel with when Jesus later gets him in the boat. Hey, do you love me? And he's like, of course, Lord, I love you. And then, feed my sheep or feed my lambs or something. And then he says, do you love me? And then Peter's got to be saying, oh God, yeah, yes, I love you. And then he's like, please don't say it again. Please don't say it again. Please. And he says, do you love me? And he's like, and it's his way of saying, I know what you did. And he says, yes, of course I love you. And he goes, okay. And it's Jesus's, very passive aggressive way of saying, look, I know what you did, because I know all the things. I forgive you. Here's what I need you to do. I've always drawn that parallel, the cock crowing 3 times and the, hey, do you love me in the boat? And that's kind of, Peter didn't kill himself, so Jesus has this opportunity, but Jesus is still going to kind of stick it to him, but he's going to do it in a very Jesus way. Jesus likes to do this kind of stuff, right? He's going to ask questions, and he's going to, whereas Judas goes, according to Matthew, and he hangs himself. I have it here.
Starting in, I think if we start at
Matthew 20, you have it. Go ahead and read it.
Yeah, I think let's look here at Matthew 27:3.
Mm-hmm.
When Judas, let's back this up on screen for everybody here so you can see 27:3. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money. After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one on whom a price has been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price. And they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord commanded me. So we've got a wrap up of some of the details we introduced earlier with the silver, but we have that moment of Matthew has Judas repentant, returning the money, trying to return the money.
Right.
And then going out to hang himself, and this name, the field of blood, because that field in Matthew was purchased with the money that had been used. So where
they can't take it back into the treasury. Now, so in the other gospels, you don't hear, he just disappears.
He's just gone.
He betrays him and he's gone. But Matthew's got this very special account of him coming back and regretting. It's, what does it say? He repents, right? He does this, and then he gives the money back. He knows he's screwed up, but then he goes out and he hangs himself. First of all, by the way, remember, he's quoting Jeremiah there at the end, But the 30 pieces of silver is actually mentioned in Zechariah. This is a Zechariah 11, and it's a story, it's a prophecy about an unworthy shepherd who essentially betrays the sheep. And he's got these two staffs. One is called Unity, and the other is called, what's the other staff's name? One is called, does anybody know? If you can say it there in the chats real quick. But he's got one is called Unity, and the other staff is called, see if anybody can get it before I do. Where did it go? Unity and Favor. Favor and Unity. He's got two staffs, and he's going to go in and he's quitting. He's basically giving up on the sheep. And he goes and he says, give me my wages. And this is Zechariah 11:12. If it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed out as my wages 30 shekels of silver. Then the Lord said, throw it into the treasury, this lordly price at which I was valued by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and I throwed it either to the potter or to the treasury in the house of the Lord. Then I broke my staff, annulling the ties between Judah and Israel. So it's an entire prophecy, it's an entire story about this shepherd that's not good, that he's giving up on these sheep. And so this is where I think the 30 shekels of silver, and he's throwing it into the temple. And this is what I think the story here in Matthew is echoing this. Keep in mind, Matthew loves to try to find any thing
Matthew
he
loves a
can from the Hebrew
prophecy.
Bible. But then he quotes Jeremiah at the end. So he's pulling from something completely different when he's talking about buying the field. So Jeremiah is trying to tie the fate of Judas to as many things as he can, but the other gospels don't pick it up. So the question is, do we actually have an accurate description of Judas's death? And the problem, of course, the reason we can ask that question is because of what we read at the beginning of the book of Acts.
Yeah, so let's go through some of the acts
Yeah.
so we can talk about our competing and often harmonized traditions. So at the beginning of the book of Acts, in Acts 1 is where we're going to be looking here. And so Acts, yes, outside of our Gospels, this is our second account. Acts gives us this version, starting in verse 16. Friends, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit through David foretold concerning Judas, who had become a guide for those who arrested Jesus. For he was numbered among us and was allotted his share in this ministry. Verse 18 says, now this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and his bowels gushed out. This became known to all the residents of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their language Hal-Kadam, that is, the field of blood. So we have a similarity here in the name of the place, the field of blood, but we have a difference in how Judas dies, a difference in how the field comes into someone's possession, and then a little bit of a unification here. So are they really, one question that gets asked, I guess we should start here. One question that gets asked is, are these really describing different things? Or is there sometimes people present an easy way to harmonize these two so that they're not conflicting, they're just giving different details of the same event?
I don't believe so. I think we've got two separate accounts. Of course, apologists will try to harmonize these two, but I think you have two different traditions here, and let's look at them. One is this parenthetic sentence that is 18 and 19 that says, this man acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness. So this says that Judas didn't return the money. He kept the money, and then he bought a field with his money. So it's not, Matthew's account is he gave the money back, and the priest said, well, we don't want this as blood money. So they bought the field. So there was a field being purchased, but one has Judas giving the money back and the priest buying the field, and the other has Judas buying the field. Judas, sorry, not Jesus, Judas. Judas buying the field. And then they say, for it's written, let him live in his, let his homestead, let another take his position. And then what happens? He fell headlong and his bowels gushed out, which is the classic punishment for someone who is considered to be, rotting from the inside. Literally,
Right.
you're so evil that you're rotting from the inside out. And this happens to not one person, not just one person in the Bible, right? Who else does this happen to in the Bible?
Well, Herod gets a similar fate with well, he gets slightly different. He's eaten by worms and died, but we get other traditions where he kind of pops from the inside out
Yeah,
in
right.
this festering.
This is Acts 12:20, right? This
Yeah.
is immediately because he had not given glory to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down and he was eaten by worms and died. But you also have this account of Herod the Great, just basically being ravaged by every disease,
Mm-hmm.
and he's just from the inside out. This notion that your bowels will just burst. You're so that it's God's punishment of just an ugly, nasty way to die, that you're just going to fall down and you're going to pop. This is what happens to bodies essentially that are left alone out in the, that are not buried, right? You're left alone, you're out in the sun, and they'll swell up and they'll pop, and then the buzzards come, and this is ugly, nasty stuff. This is the least dignified way to die. You're basically an unburied body, your
Mm-hmm.
body left out in the field, except that happens like that. And so basically it's saying that this is a way to die that is a punishment from God. And
And
so one is Judas hangs himself, gives the money back, and someone else buys the field. This one is he took the money, he bought a field, but he wasn't able to enjoy it because he fell down and he literally popped and died. Those are two different stories.
and
Those
they
are
there is a I think a version of harmonization that we need to address too that typically gets brought up here of how these two can be working together, which for some people find it compelling. There are still some parts of it that don't quite line up, and that's that Matthew describes Judas hanging himself. And Acts is coming in later and describing, although it doesn't say it, it's talking about a scene maybe a few days later when the
right,
rope snaps or the branch breaks and Judas falls down. And as Judas had been hanging for a few days, he had bloated. And then at that
right.
moment that he pops. However, we still have some contradictions. One of them, and this is a point that Bart Ehrman makes frequently, is that
Mhm.
Acts describes Judas as falling head first here. And if he was hanging and he falls down from the tree, if the rope snaps, he's not going to be falling head first. He's going to be, his feet are going to hit the ground.
Right.
Unless now we need to bring in an object, that there's some kind of object underneath his feet that he hits that's going to tip him over so he can fall. So we've got to make
No.
additional apologetics to try to bring this in versus what seems to be, we have two different traditions. One that is
Yeah.
in Matthew describing him hanging himself, doing something that the other gospels don't do. They don't talk about his death. And Acts
Yeah.
bringing in this divine punishment, which it also does elsewhere. Herod isn't doing anything that then leads to him. He had hung himself and then bloated and gets struck by worms. So
Right.
pushing these two together in a way that
Yeah.
they're not really concerned about doing. We know lots of other instances where they present us two accounts that differ and they're happy to leave them side by side because they're doing different things.
Yeah. But that brings us to our question of the day. Did Judas die twice? Like Goliath? No, he died probably once, but there are two different accounts of his death. Did Judas, he did something that he felt that he regretted. Um, according to Matthew.
According to Matthew.
In Mark, Luke, and John, he
Takes the
got
money and
away.
runs.
And according to Acts, he tried to buy a field and enjoy the rest of his life, but he was punished apparently by God, fell headlong, and burst. This is, again, it's understood to be a punishment from God. Um, and that's the end of it. But what you have is two, and again, I hate using the word contradictory, but you have two versions. You have two different versions of the death of Judas. So he dies once, but in two different accounts. And again, one of these is an Acts. One of these isn't a gospel account. Maybe that's Luke's account, right? If Luke and Acts are the
Mm-hmm.
same, it's maybe that's Luke's account as opposed to Matthew's account. But again, you've got two different stories of Judas's death, which brings us back to, did Judas need to do this? Or are we reading it in retrospect, right? This is just what happened to happen. And, Jesus went on with it. And this is what way Judas is remembered until, of course, we get the Gospel of Judas.
Mm-hmm.
When you have this movement to try to go back and basically write Rogue One,
Yeah.
and Star Wars, and try to do all these backstories of all these characters that elevate them, that try
Right.
to celebrate them and say, wow, I know it looks bad, but what he was actually doing was, and then they tell these stories that
Right.
venerate these apostles.
Well, and this isn't the only moment. It's not the only moment in Judas's story where we get these contradicting accounts. It's an important one. It's one that gets a lot of attention, but we have different versions of why does he do what he does, or why does he approach this? Does the devil enter him? Is he doing it on his own? How much money does he get? How do things happen in the garden? How do things happen at the table? Because there are these different versions, these different retellings of this story. And so as we look through all of Judas's life in the Gospels, we get different versions of what Judas is doing and why, and it just seems to naturally culminate in two different versions of his death. And so I find it interesting that this one gets so much more attention than the others. The others were happy to say, well, he took 30 pieces of silver, perfect. And it's the one that's got the bread dip, perfect. We'll take that one, and we'll take the kiss in the garden. That's nice. And we make this storyline that goes together. And then for some reason, when we get to the death, we go, oh, we've got a contradiction. We have had them all along. We just move past them right until the Gnostic question comes up. And Judas needs to do this because Judas is the only one there that understands who Jesus is. The other disciples don't.
He's the true disciple. Yeah. And again, even with the kiss, right? What is Romans? Is it Romans 16:16, or is it greet each other with a kiss?
Mm-hmm.
And this was a common way to greet people, right? So it's something that was common. You just walk up and, hey, how's it going? But Jesus, it's going to become this famous line. Is it with a kiss that you betray?
Right.
So the Judas kiss, right? It becomes something because of the events that took place afterwards. But up until that point, it was just hey, how's it going? But it happened to be the one that I kiss. And that was that particular gospel's, telling of that story. But up until that point, it was just walking up and shaking hands, basically. He's walking up and saying hi. It wasn't a thing until it was a thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's the line, right? It's not a thing until it's a thing. But it was made a thing because of what happened afterwards. The 30 pieces of silver, Matthew's looking for it to be a thing, right? He's going back, and it's 30 for this reason. But the kiss, okay.
It becomes one of those things that, but it's such a powerful image. It's a thing that we can hold on to. It's the thumbnail for this video because you see it and you see that moment and you know the story and you know what goes on behind it. But it is an end, maybe, because I mean, there is also those that say, well, Matthew and Luke, if Luke is writing Acts or the version of Acts, is just trying to present something here because Mark and nobody else is talking about this. But we can't have Judas just take the money and ride off into the sunset. That's not a satisfying end to the betrayal story. That's a big problem. So he's
got to die.
He needs to die. And maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But Judas is one of those problematic figures that usually when people talk about, are any of these people real, they go, well, Judas is one of those that people put on the yes category just because of he's so difficult and uncomfortable and completing traditions. It's not smooth. It's not perfect. He's not the same everywhere.
Right. And remember, I keep coming back to this kiss. I say, the Judas kiss wasn't a thing until it was a thing. That's just how people greeted each other. But I think that kiss becomes such a narrative trope, right? It just becomes, I mean, U2 sings about it, right? It becomes that thing because when do people experience betrayal most commonly, right? It is with intimacy. It's with someone you kiss this person and then one of them breaks up or one of them, cheats or one of them. And so the kiss means more than just the Jesus story. It means more than just religion. That kiss, transcends human life. You can betray someone with a kiss beyond Christianity. And I think that's why that becomes the most powerful. That's the story we pull.
Mm,
And Judas just, disappearing after betraying, that's not a powerful literary trope, right?
no.
But him either falling into the field or dying and, getting what he deserves, type thing. That's what we hold on to. This is the way the story should end, right? The bad guy shouldn't get away type thing.
Right.
And he needs to be a bad guy. We can't
He
have
needs-
the Gospel of Judas, right?
No.
And so that's what I think. This is what I think drives harmonization when you have two different stories.
I think that's a helpful, maybe hopefully a helpful survey of the Judas tradition here. Judas, maybe not surprisingly, he gets left here, he goes behind. Next week we're going to be talking about resurrections. Judas is not included in the resurrection list. But next week, leading into Esther, into Easter, we're going to be talking about some resurrection stories here, because Jesus isn't the only resurrected person that we have in the biblical record. So yes, we are going to be talking about the Jesus resurrection accounts, but as well as some others. Some maybe that you know, some maybe that you don't know, and some of the questions that go along with that, like what exactly happens to a person who was dead that is now undead, and where do they go from here? So that's what we've got for you next week. Come back to Bible and Archaeology Live for that conversation. For everyone that joined us here live today, we're so happy that you joined us here for this chat. For anybody watching on replay, thank you for stopping in. Feel free to subscribe to see more from us. Visit the Bible and Archaeology website to get news updates. And come on back next week for that Bible and Archaeology Live about resurrections. We look forward to seeing you there. Bob, is there anything you want to leave off with here as we wrap up this Judas conversation?
Go Hawks.
Go Hawks. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. For Dr. Bob Cargill, thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend.